Hey everyone, this is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. Happy Friday, everybody. Today we are going to take a look at Venus's recent entrance into the sign of Aries. For those of you who are not familiar, I have a series that I did a while back called Planets in Profile, where we took a look at Mercury, Mars, and Venus through all 12 signs. I'm about to be rebooting that series with the Moon in the next month or so here after finishing my series on the Tao Te Ching for astrologers, which has taken up the better part of about a year. So we're about to reboot that series. And as a way of doing that, as Venus, Mercury, Mars have been changing signs over the past months, I have occasionally rebooted one of those episodes just to kind of wet your whistle. So I hope that you guys will enjoy this exploration of Venus into Aries. It's funny to look back at this one. This is from my blue office, which is 2 offices ago, before we moved back to Minnesota. So this is extra old school. But I think it still holds up. It's a great talk and a good exploration of Venus in the sign of the Ram, which was classically said to be Venus's detriment, or exile, which really just means that there is a kind of archetypal tension that's present when you take Venus and put it into one of Mars's signs. The same thing can be said when Mars is placed into Venus's signs. You just get a Venus that is behaving or acting out through the lens of Mars. And there's a kind of tension in that is really beautiful, actually. There's a dynamism in Venus's placement in Aries. This will also be preparing us for looking at Venus's upcoming conjunction with Jupiter in the sign of Aries, which we will look at through a whole video next week. Anyway, so I'm also really excited, like I said, to be rebooting this series by looking at the moon through all of the 12 signs. So we will be doing that probably the next 3 weeks or so as I kind of take a little break and recalibrate after finishing the Tao Te Ching for Astrologers series. And then we'll be occasionally dropping new episodes of the moon through the signs. So anyway, I hope you guys had a great week and that you'll have a great weekend, and that this exploration of Venus in Aries will also be useful for all of you, whether by transit we're looking at this right now or just studying it because you have it in your natal chart or you know someone who does. I think you'll get something good out of this. So before we get into it, don't forget to like and subscribe, share your comments, click on the notification bell if you want to know when I'm going live. You can find transcripts of any of my daily talks on the website, as you guys know, which is nightlightastrology.com. Any questions about what you find on the website, whether it's classes, readings, courses, all the good stuff that we offer there, you can email us, info@nightlightastrology.com. All right, well, that's it. Enjoy the video today.
Hi, everybody. This is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology, and this is another episode of Planets in Profile. So today I'm catching up a little bit because I'm a little bit behind on this series. I'm catching up on Venus in Aries today in this episode. Venus is just about to leave the sign of Aries, so that's why I say it's a little bit late, but I'm trying to keep up with this series as Venus and Mars in particular go through the 12 signs. So that's the 2 planets that I'm starting with in this series. And then as I go on, gradually I'll work my way through the rest of the planets. So I'm going to go ahead and put a little presentation up on the screen so that you can see it and see a few notes that I have for you guys today. The gist of Venus in Aries is that Venus is hanging out in a Mars-ruled sign, and that has a tremendous impact on Venus's signification in any kind of chart that you're looking at. So we want to understand what that means and how to interpret that, and just a feel for Venus and Aries in general. Now, one of the things that I thought was very appropriate, especially given our most recent episode of Game of Thrones, was as a picture of Daenerys Targaryen. So if you don't know that show, then no worries. And if you do, there are going to be some spoilers to come in this episode because I'm going to talk about the most recent episode. So close your ears, turn off the volume, whatever. Come back to this after you've seen the most recent episode. There's only 1 episode left in the series, by the way. At any rate, so let's go ahead and discuss. Venus, we've been taking Venus through all of the signs. Once you get to the sign of Aries, Venus actually is behaving not completely dissimilar from how she behaves when she's in Scorpio, which is another Mars-ruled sign, feminine Mars-ruled sign. So still quite a bit different feel in Aries compared to Scorpio, but this is a Mars-themed Venus So planetary combinations or blendings of planets expressing themselves through the lens of another planet is one of the most basic ways that we come to interpret anything in astrology. And one of the things that unfortunately happens in modern forms of astrology is where we think of the planets in signs as psychological profiling devices. So Venus and Aries, we jump right to psychological descriptions, not understanding how those descriptions are formed. For example, a lot of people think that Venus and Aries is just sort of a combination of themes that come from the sign of Aries and the planet Venus. And that's partially correct, but also it has a lot to do with, even more so than Venus being in the sign of Aries, it has a lot to do with Venus being in the sign of Mars. So planetary combinations are the most basic elemental components of the language of astrology. One of the reasons in my programs that I teach only the traditional 7 planets in the first whole year is so that people can get a really deep and basic grasp of the way that the traditional signs, planets, houses, and aspects are used, because most people actually don't know how to use them. They just have stereotypes in their heads from memes and, sort of cheap internet astrology. No offense to anyone, there's just a lot of crap out there, unfortunately. So at any rate, Venus in Aries was traditionally said to be in her exile, or sometimes we call it a detriment. This is always the case when any planet that has rulership in its own sign, like Mercury in Gemini or Jupiter in Sagittarius, is found to be in the sign exactly opposite from its own home sign, Jupiter in Gemini or Mercury in Sagittarius. In the case of Venus and Mars, it's always Venus in a Mars-ruled sign or Mars in a Venus-ruled sign, like Mars in Taurus or Mars in Libra, versus Venus in Aries or Venus in Scorpio. Whenever these conditions happen, we call that planet, there's a name for it, and we say the planet is in its exile or in its detriment. Detriment isn't really the right word. It doesn't have the greatest connotation, because detriment really sounds like it's weakened, and it's, and the planet in its exile is not necessarily weakened as much as it is describing an environmental condition that it's facing, that the planet is facing, that's not entirely easy. So for example, Venus loves peace, harmony, friendship, beauty, and so forth. And Aries is a Mars-ruled sign, and Mars is the god of war. So it's that fundamental tension between the opposite archetypal qualities of Venus and Mars that becomes more intense when Venus is in a Mars-ruled sign like Aries. She's in a foreign land. She's in a land that is not conducive to her own natural significations. She's in a place that, she's a house guest, as I've been saying throughout the series, you imagine that Venus is a house guest in Mars's house. She would like a nice chat with friends, and Mars is going to provide her with a couple of barbarians to chat with, a couple of Vikings. So Aries is a hot, dry, masculine, tropical fire sign. What does that mean? Well, hot and dry means that's related to fire. Hot and dry is stubborn. It likes to shape the world to its will. It's fierce. It's active. It's dynamic. It's expressive. It's very strong and willful. Because and that goes along with the masculine or yang orientation of the sign. Tropical, meaning it has the word comes from tropical from the word tropos, which means to turn. Sometimes they're called movable signs, which means that they initiate action, and there's a lot of change that's featured. A planet in a cardinal sign is always going to be very dynamic and very changeable. Sometimes, for example, people really misunderstand mutable or double-bodied signs, thinking, well, those are the changeable ones. But actually, double-bodied signs display a variation between solid and unmoving and very movable. So they vacillate between being fixed and being changeable. The changeable signs, the tropical signs, are just straight up changeable. They initiate change and action, and they're always in sort of dynamic, transformative flow mode, you might say, like all the time. So if you have planets, for example, in a cardinal sign, the karma around a particular signification in your chart might be more easy to change. It might be more dynamic and fluid and changeable. Whereas, planet in a fixed sign, sometimes it's a lot less likely that karma or that pattern, whatever the planet or chart indicator might be pointing us to in the life of the individual, is less likely to change. So for these reasons, put Venus in this sign, and she may naturally struggle with some of these things because she prefers grace, harmony, beauty, friendship, cleanliness. And this is a place that is more willful, hot, impulsive, sometimes reckless or destructive, competitive, aggressive. It's a little bit more self-centered, a little bit less we, a little bit more me. So those reasons, it's a tense place for Venus to be. Venus is hosted by Mars whenever she travels through Aries. So you always, in order to understand exactly how Venus is behaving in your birth chart or anywhere else when she's in Aries, you have to look at the Mars placement. So for example, right now, Mars is in the sign of Gemini. What that means is that Venus is, as Venus travels through Aries, she is having her needs met by Mars in Gemini. So Venus wants friendship. What is she going to get? Competitive, mental, curious, combative, aggressive, but intelligent material to work with, right? She's going to get Mars and Gemini-like stuff. That's because her host, Mars and Gemini, is providing for her needs. So you always have to look at where is Mars to get a pretty distinct sense of what Venus is up to. Now, when you combine that with it, house placement, aspects, day or nighttime charts, sect considerations, all different kinds of essential dignity conditions, different forms of accidental dignity, it becomes very, very specific, which is why, again, it's very important to just be careful of cliches when it comes to any planet in any sign. Whenever you hear people saying, well, this is what Venus in Aries is like, hands down, you should the skepticism, the caution flag should be raised, because if that person is not taking into consideration, for example, the placement of Mars in that natal chart and its relation to Venus by aspect and house position and so on and so forth, they're not going to have it's not specific enough. It'd be like saying all people who play sports are the same. All women who wear red are the same. Do you know what I mean? These are generalities. It's not really doing astrology. In some ways it helps us. There's a pattern recognition that can help to get some of these cliches down, like Venus in Aries is sexy and aggressive, some kind of cliche like that. Okay, so that can help us on a certain level, but astrology is much more sophisticated than that. And so we have to learn how to track, at the very least, the dispositor of Venus in Aries, which is always going to be Mars. So in terms of the natural significations you might see, these are a list of some, talk about both sides of my mouth. Here are some cliches. So Venus may enjoy or find beauty or harmony or aesthetic value in things that are more martial. That would be things that are more aggressive, things that are more, kind of the hunt, the thrill, the fight, things that are more fiery, fierce, willful, dominant, or assertive. But Venus may delight in those things or find beauty or pleasure, or even find some degree of harmony and beauty within those topics. She may become more fiery, aggressive, and impulsive, and that can be upsetting. For example, when someone has, and I'm going to use now, this is your Game of Thrones spoiler alert, so plug your ears, put on earmuffs. This latest episode of Game of Thrones, which, by the way, I have to issue this disclaimer really quickly. I don't have a TV any longer, so I'm making a special exception to watch this series because I've been following it for however many years now, like 10. I don't know. It seems like it's been forever. So even though I don't really watch TV anymore, I felt like I had to follow this through and see how it ends. I have been reading the books too. And not surprisingly, for a long time, I felt like, Daenerys is a really complicated character, the Dragon Queen. She's, she is really self-centered and arrogant and proud and desiring and covetous of power, for as much as she is also sort of morally upright, progressive, open-minded, is kind of a humanitarian. So I've always been very skeptical of her, even though I've really liked her at times. And I think every character in Game of Thrones, for the most part, is like that. There are very few exceptions where there are not serious character complications. Even the Starks have their own character complications. They seem to be the bastions of like traditional morality, but they even have their complications. For example, loyalty tends to be a very complicated thing for them. But at any rate, Daenerys levels the city in a self-righteous rage. And she falls in line with her ancestors who have a trigger, a switch that they turn where they go mad. The Mad King, her grandfather or whatever, had wanted to burn it all down, burn them all. And so this kind of kamikaze, kind of like kamikaze is not the right word. I'm sure that's actually an inappropriate word. I think it comes from World War II. But the that kind of like just throw yourself into the flames, a sort of suicide bombing mission that she goes on, is of course really upsetting. This is very Venus and Aries in the sense that Venus and Aries, the shadow side sometimes is there might be a good cause, like the warrior that wants to fight for the right cause, for the morally progressive stance, but will stoop to the level of their enemies in the process, or will mix the desire for dominance and power with the desire to help or to protect. And so when someone becomes very aggressive about peace, it's always a little, the boundaries can get blurred a little bit. So you always have to be careful of the mixture of I'm doing this because it's the good and the right thing to do, but it's actually this kind of hyper aggressive thing that I'm doing. That can be a shadow side of Venus and Aries. And there's lots of others that are like that, but you get kind of get the feeling of blending the god of war with the god of peace, and so it can get a little messy. You may ride on a dragon and burn a whole city. So at any rate, but some other people have been complaining about this episode, saying, oh, it's just like it's the worst, blah, blah, blah. And I haven't liked the writing for a while now in the show, but I can say that I honestly saw this coming for a while, because this is in her blood, it's in her background, it's a complication of her character that's always been there. And I'm not surprised to see her having a really difficult time sort of bending the knee to Jon Snow, and instead going on a self-righteous crusade and really losing her shit. And by the way, when this started happening, Venus and Aries was square to Saturn and Pluto and Capricorn. And that's as the collective is taking in this story. It's very good for those of us who are liberal, because when there's a clear Cersei, when there's like a clear and apparent moral enemy, it's very easy to think that we should resort to anything to take that person out because it's for the good. But of course, that makes us like our enemies. And there's something really complicated about that. And that's been covered in so many different places, Star Wars, and it's in the news right now. I was watching, I was on vacation last week and I had an occasion to watch something on TV, which I don't usually do. And it was the Bill Maher show. And Bill Maher is, of course, he's always sort of going off about how liberals need to put on the boxing gloves and actually, beat some people up or whatever. And I'm never impressed by that argument. I'm a bit more on the side of Michelle Obama. If someone goes low, we go high. I think that that's a better way, because I think of the consequences in terms of eternity, not terms of the immediate. But that's me. That's my own orientation. The Venus and Aries, sometimes there are causes where you really have to go to battle. You really have to sort of, just take the difficult path of engaging with an enemy in a very direct and confrontational way for the sake of peace. So I'm not saying that there isn't a place for it, but it's a complicated archetypal dynamic. That's the point. Now, in terms of just everyday people where you can see um, uh, Venus and Aries on display in their lives. I have a pretty cool list that you can think about with me. So Marilyn Monroe, classic example of someone who was incredibly ambitious and also very opportunistic. She had sexual abuse in her past, and also used many men as they used her for different things. Like many of the men that she dated helped her get a leg up in Hollywood, and she would discard them when she was done. Can you blame her? They were also using her for obvious reasons, not necessarily caring about her as a person. But this was a theme in her life. It was very complicated, and relationships were very they were very complex and often filled with difficulties. A relationship with Joe DiMaggio, where he became violent with her, and there's a lot of abuse and violence and aggression, and also opportunism and ambition and greed that are all wrapped up in many of her relationships, where there's a kind of I use you, you use me theme. Lady Gaga. I think of Lady Gaga I don't know her story well, but in terms of the bravado and the intensity and the toughness and just the kind of experimental, edgy quality of her Venus, to me, she has this kind of tough girl meets sort of like Renaissance artist, So I think Venus in Aries is really kind of neat in her chart. I don't know a lot about her personal life, but Audrey Hepburn is another example of someone, a very ambitious Hollywood actress who comes across in many ways as very sort of polite and, unassuming or whatever. But, in some of her films anyways, when her characters are often sort of like, they look sort of charming and sweet, but they have this edge, this feistiness. And Audrey Hepburn, of course, also struggled with, thought to have struggled with, I think it was an eating disorder, if I remember correctly. But there were other things too in her past around, I think there was maybe it was, I'm going to forget, but there was something that was very complicated about her childhood that was probably related to some eating disorder problems. But please, someone correct me if I'm wrong about that, because it's been a while since I've read about Audrey Hepburn. But another very aggressive, dynamic, kind of fiery woman who oftentimes you don't think of as so fiery. And again, that's the complication of Venus and Aries. Bob Marley, peace-loving guy, right? And yet, as a Rastafarian, he also had there's sort of a militant side to him. There was a sort of like, he was, how can you put it? There was a sense of revolutionary, and and his life is there's stories of an attempted assassination on his life and things like that. His music is very peace-loving, but it's also aggressive and has this revolutionary flavor to it. Sigmund Freud, of course, so much of the central, the core of his research and theoretical work in psychology has to do with the libido, the sex drive, the unconscious realities of sexuality in our lives and how they shape us. It was very Venus and Aries. Abraham Lincoln is a guy who wanted peace, but had to fight through the Civil War. Wanted freedom for slaves in the South, had to fight for it. Johnny Cash, incredibly turbulent love relationship with his wife, June. Well, if you've ever seen the movie about that, a musician, but really kind of messed up love life in a lot of ways. Floyd Mayweather, right? He's kind of like an icon for wealth and status and sort of class and charm, but also he's a boxer, and he's also like really sort of arrogant and sort of overpowering, So it's interesting because Muhammad Ali also had Mars in Taurus, which is a Venus ruled sign, so similar kind of combination. Charles Darwin, survival, sort of the theory of evolution and the sort of idea of survival of the fittest that comes to be associated with Darwin It's a very Venus and Aries kind of thing. Rosa Parks, civil rights icon. She does something great. She's a fighter, you know, so it's Venus and Aries, kind of the positive. George Carlin, really, really funny. Venus performer, very edgy, very aggressive, you know. Jim Jones, a cult leader, right? Very attractive, very appealing, but dangerous and actually really violent. Miles Davis, also very controversial, very provocative jazz musician, and edgy, especially in the, you know, so sort of the 60s and the sort of psychedelics and things like that. And so he has this really, how can I put it? When I think of Miles Davis, I think of someone whose music is beautiful, but it has this real depth and edge to it. And it has this kind of like assertiveness to it. You can feel, especially when you look at his album covers in particular, very Venus and Aries. Alejandro Jodorowsky, if you know him, very experimental filmmaker and author, and he's kind of a jack of all trades. He's kind of a modern mystic, but he's very provocative in what he says and does with his artwork in particular, and always has been. I think it was Mystic Mountain, or I forget what it was called. Dennis Rodman, really controversial basketball player, sort of has a kind of, he had like, in the 1990s, you know, he had like crazy colored hair and like his nose was pierced, and, you know, he showed up dressed as a woman in a bride outfit, I think, in a magazine or something. I don't remember, but he's always really controversial with fashion, and he's sort of a tough guy, but he's also sort of like this, you know, fashionista. Like, he's just a very interesting character. Jet Li, beautiful and deadly martial artist, right? Sofia Coppola, first American woman, if I remember correctly, to be nominated for Best Director at the Oscars. I don't remember what it was for, but it might have been Virgin Suicides. But anyway, she's this really provocative, edgy, but also really beautiful filmmaker. She makes these really beautiful films, and she has this really like kind of feminist edge to her work. And so, you know, Venus and Aries. Jean-Paul Gaultier, a fashion designer, also very provocative, interesting, experimental. He didn't have formal fashion training, if I remember correctly. He was sort of an upstart. Anyway, so that gives you some ideas of what Venus and Aries people are like, or the profiles of some Venus and Aries individuals. So I hope you find this interesting, and as always, and I will be back shortly, maybe later today or maybe tomorrow, from Mars and Gemini, which will catch me up entirely with the Planets in Profile series. So tell me your Venus and Aries stories. If you have Venus and Aries in your chart, where's Mars? Try to include that. See what you come up with. I'd love to hear from you guys in the YouTube feed. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.